بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وبعد. So last week we covered the virtue of knowledge, and we are going to today look at the virtue of learning and the virtue of teaching. And of course, if you understand the virtue of knowledge, then you will understand the virtue of learning and the virtue of teaching. But there are particular verses of the Quran and ahadith, prophetic traditions, which indicate the virtue of learning and teaching. And as we said previously, that we are an ummah of education, we are an ummah of learning, and we are an ummah of educating. So we should try to be one of the two, either in the state of learning or the state of teaching others. And it's always possible for a person to learn and to teach. It doesn't mean that a person has to be qualified in specialized sciences, etc., for you to teach. But what it does mean is that a person should know their remits and know their limitations. And we're going to come to something of the sort today, inshallah. So Imam Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, Fadilatul Ta'allum, the virtue, the merit of learning. He says, أما الآيات فقوله تعالى فلولا نفر من كل فرقة منهم طائفة ليتفقهوا في الدين. So as we mentioned previously, he'll start by mentioning a verse of the Quran, and then a statement of the Prophet ﷺ, or an action of the Prophet ﷺ, and then he will mention one of the statements of the earlier generations of Islam. In the original he mentions many, and then he will go on to mention the evidences of a logical nature, which indicate what we're discussing, the topic that we're discussing. So he says, he starts off with the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives indication of the importance of learning and the importance of teaching at the same time, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about those believers that went out with the Prophet ﷺ, and for the sake of jihad and the sake of defending the Muslims and so on and so forth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if a contingent of the believers would remain behind so that they can teach, so that they can learn and then teach those that come back to them. لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ. And then by doing a tafaqquh fi الدِّينِ, when the believers return, they would impart that which they had learned, that which they had studied. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, al-Ghazali says, وَقَوْلُهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ, the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of dhikr. And some may say, what does dhikr have to do with knowledge? True dhikr is knowledge. Ahlul dhikri here are the people of knowledge. And the circles of dhikr, the true circles of dhikr, are the circles of knowledge. And we mentioned that the ultimate form of dhikr is what? Is to learn and to apply. When a person applies Islam, they are in a state of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with their actions. So a person that's praying, he's in a state of dhikr. Not only with his tongue, but he should be anyway with his heart, with his mind, with the rest of his limbs. Likewise, when a person gives zakah, he's in a state of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a person learns, he's in a state of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the first verse, فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ, that verse indicates that knowledge, learning, is actually fard kifaya. It is a collective duty. It's something which is compulsory upon the collective, compulsory upon the believers, to have a portion of our population who are dedicated to the study of deen. And we're going to look into this matter further, inshallah, in the upcoming categories, what is actually compulsory for us to learn. So we won't go into too much detail now, but it's good to ask ourselves these questions. How is it that we can establish? How is it that we can take care of? How is it that we can expand the affairs of the believers? How can we establish Iman? How can we take care of Iman? How can we expand Iman? These questions should be asked, because those questions give indication to the types of knowledge that we should be studying. If a person understands their own state, they will understand what knowledge they should be studying. If If a person who has no understanding of the foundations of Islam, no understanding of the obligations of Islam, the prohibitions of Islam, if that person starts to study, for example, the various sects of Islam that appeared throughout the history of Islam, this person is wasting his or her time. Likewise, if a person who does not know the foundational tenets of faith starts to delve into the complicated matters of theology, this person again is wasting their time. And it's very important that we understand our level. You would not take a primary school child and place that primary school child into a university level classroom. Likewise, you would not take someone who does not have primary level of understanding in Islam and place that person into a university level classroom. And I say that as an example because of course it's difficult to say what is university level, what is primary level. That we don't have such categories in the sense that university level is not necessarily better than primary level, but just as a way of trying to conceptualize. And so it's important to know our states as learners, and it's important to know the states of others as those that we teach. If a person comes to us to learn and we start to teach them complicated, complex, overly theoretical matters, and we don't teach them the basics, then we can harm this individual. Likewise, if a person comes and let's say in our context today, and this is perhaps a lot more relevant, a person comes into Islam or a person starts practicing Islam and that person doesn't pay any attention to the purity of their heart, doesn't pay any attention to cleansing their heart, living in a society which is full of sicknesses of the heart, that person's Islam will suffer later on. A person who has lived a life of chasing after their desires, a person who has lived a life of soaking up the filthy ideas of society according to his context or her context, and does not spend time to purify his heart of such things, i.e. desires and these concepts, etc., that person can potentially harm his or her Islam in the future, because those things in the heart will have an impact on that person's Islam. And that's why you find people start to practice Islam and they burn out, or they start to take the wrong route. Why? Because they haven't taken the time to purify their hearts. They haven't taken the time to learn about their hearts. So al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he mentions the ayah, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. And so this shows the virtue of seeking knowledge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to ask, commanded us to learn. And the scholars of Islam, they mention that there are two places where shyness is not something which is praiseworthy. And that's an interesting discussion in of itself. Shyness. Should a man be shy? Because today we have individuals who assume that shyness in a man is not a good quality. But the Prophet ﷺ was described as being shy in some instances. But the case anyway, that shyness in learning is not a praiseworthy quality. Why? Because it leads to ignorance. When a person does not know, they should have the courage to put their hand up and say, I don't know, and I would like to know, so please teach me. And many a time when a person asks a question, they don't realize that many other people want to ask the same question, but they were just too shy to ask. And some of the companions, they mentioned that they were happy when the believers who lived in the nomadic regions came to the Prophet ﷺ to ask questions, because they would have a boldness about them and they would ask questions that the companions would feel too shy to ask. Then al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he says, وَأَمَّا الْأَخْبَارِ فَقَوْلُهُ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ مَنْ سَلَكَ طَرِيقًا يَطْلُبُ فِيهِ عِلْمًا سَلَكَ اللَّهُ بِهِ طَرِيقًا إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ. He mentions the famous hadith that I'm sure many have heard: whoever takes a path wherein he seeks knowledge, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make a path for him to Jannah which is easy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will facilitate for him a path to paradise. And of course there is a condition here, if that person has the correct intention. If a person seeks knowledge for the wrong reasons, then that knowledge will not benefit that person. For example, you find Orientalists who live a lifetime studying Islam, but yet that which they study does not guide them into accepting Islam. So that's the issue there is the wrong intention. A person who studies something looking for the mistakes is not going to find guidance in that thing. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can guide whoever He so chooses and is pleased to guide, but generally speaking. Likewise, a person who starts to study Islam and they do want guidance, but perhaps they have the intention of showing off. And al-Ghazali, he details the issue of intention, and we'll get to it inshallah. But in summary, he says that there are three types. A person who seeks knowledge only for the status, only for the wealth, only for the fame. And this person is fooled into believing that he is actually seeking knowledge for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the knowledge becomes the vehicle. The knowledge becomes the vehicle for fame, for status, for wealth. He says this person is in a very, very dangerous situation. If he does not wake up and realize what he's doing, he is taking himself to the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, we should place a disclaimer there, unless Allah chooses to forgive him. As when the ulama state that this thing is punishable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or this person is deserving of the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what they mean is if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to punish them. The second person he mentions is the person who seeks knowledge and they want guidance, but they are also looking for fame. They are also looking to find status. And they're aware of that sickness in their intention, that issue. So this person is to struggle. They have to struggle with their intention. And the third person is the person who is seeking knowledge purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are seeking knowledge because they want to apply it. They want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're not concerned with anything else. And of course that is a very, very difficult thing to achieve, and it's only achieved via Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the early scholars of Islam, he was asked about ikhlas, and he said the answer in short, and yu'afik Allah, that it is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you afiyah. Basically, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects you from the evils of your own heart. Because finding ikhlas is something which is very difficult. And one of the scholars of Islam, they said to do an action for the sake of the people is insincere, and to leave off an action for the sake of people is insincere. So how are you supposed to do anything? It's to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask Him to guide you and facilitate for you a sincere intention. Then he mentions the statements of some of the early generations of Islam. He starts with Ibn al-Mubarak. He says, rahimahullah, وَأَمَا الْآثَارِ فَقَالِ Ibn al-Mubarak, rahimahullah ta'ala. And Ibn al-Mubarak, he was someone who put his hands into all of the virtuous areas of Islam. He passed away as a martyr. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from him. He said, rahimahullah, عَجِبْتُ لِمَنْ لَمْ يَطْلُبِ الْعِلْمِ كَيْفَ تَدْعُوهُ نَفْسُهُ إِلَى مَكْرَمَةٍ. He says, the affair of the one who doesn't seek knowledge is very, very strange. How does he know what to perform of virtuous acts? And if you take time to reflect over this, the person that doesn't seek knowledge, the person who doesn't have a framework of understanding that which is virtuous from that which is not virtuous, how is it possible that he can engage in virtuous acts? And we see this in our time today, where that which would have previously been deemed something immoral is now deemed moral. And that which is deemed previously moral is deemed immoral. Why? Because those who are deeming these things as such do not have a framework for which they can understand morality from immorality. They cannot understand virtue from vice. And so for us it's very clear. Why? Because we have a framework. And sometimes we forget that we have a framework. And we look at others and we question, how can they see this as being something which is good? Because we forget they don't have the framework of Islam that we have, which is a blessing. And previously, the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews, they had a similar framework. But today, society has been stripped of such views. Society has become a godless society, a society which is driven and a society which drives by the nafs. We have our lower desires driving us, and we are being driven by the lower desires of others. A person wants to become as wealthy as possible. So they will use the most manipulative of forms in trying to make you a consumer of their product. So you're falling victim to that person's lower desires. And our lower desires are saying, yes, I want that product. So we fall victim to our lower desires at the same time. And it's very easy to mask something as virtuous. The path to hellfire, as is often said, is paved with good intentions. So for us, we should realize and recognize the blessing that we have in Islam, that something can pop up and we can immediately say, this is wrong. How so? By returning back to the framework that we have, which is God-given. And so Ibn Mubarak is saying, how can a person who doesn't understand anything know what is virtuous from that which is not virtuous? And why would a person want to know that which is virtuous? So that he can act upon that thing which is virtuous. And that, again, is an indication of what type of knowledge should be studied. And there's a very good book, very short, which I would recommend. It's Fadlul Ilm by Ibn Rajab, rahimahullah, The Merit of Knowledge. It's a very short book, but I would highly recommend it to everyone. It's available in English if you can't read the Arabic. And then he said, rahimahullah ta'ala, وقال أبو الدرداء رضي الله تعالى عنه كن عالما أو متعلما أو مستمعا ولا تكن الرابع فتهلك. He said that Abu Darda, the companion of the Prophet ﷺ, gave us three people that we should aspire to be. Number one, the alim, the learned person. Number two, the muta'allim, the person who is in the process of learning. And number three I should say, the person who is listening. So for example, you will have a class, and in that class you have the teacher, you have the students, i.e. those who are trying to become learned people, and you have those that are simply listening. They might not be there all the time, or they might not be taking notes and trying to become learned people themselves, but they are listening. He says, وَلَا تَكُنِ الرَّابِعَ فَتَهْلُكَ. But do not be the fourth person, otherwise you will destroy yourself. Who is the fourth person? The fourth person who is neither one of the three. He is not a learned person, nor is he aspiring to be a learned person, nor is he a person who is listening to the circles of the learned. He is a person who is disassociated from knowledge, disassociated from remembrance. And maybe we can add a fifth to that, and perhaps it would fall under the category of the fourth. Do not be an enemy of the learned. Today we have people who are enemies of the learned. We have people who take the learned as their enemies. And they are from our own community. How so? A person who is learned is speaking on a matter, and then you have a person who is completely unqualified attacking that person. And it does not matter what the opinion of that learned person is. They are learned, and we are unlearned. We should know our place. As the example that was given previously, if a person were to go to the doctors, they were to go to see their GP, and their GP prescribed some medicine for them, they would not argue with their GP. They would not turn around and say to their GP, you're ignorant, you don't know what you're talking about, you're just trying to prescribe these drugs to me because you're going to get some sort of money from the company that you're ordering the drugs from, and so on and so forth. We wouldn't be bold enough to say such a thing to our GPs. Why? Because we know that we're unqualified. Likewise, when it comes to economics, when it comes to politics, and so on and so forth. Is the deen cheaper than that which relates to medicine? It's not. If a person were to harm another person's body through mispractice, it is better than harming a person's deen through mispractice. Why? The body is temporary. The body doesn't last very long. But our deen is eternal. Or I should say, the consequences of the way that we apply our deen is eternal. And so you find a person who is not qualified, he's not learned, he's not currently learning, he perhaps doesn't attend, or he maybe attends a select circles of the learned, or the perceived to be learned, and he is attacking other people who are learned. This is very dangerous. You may have a person who is now a representative of the deen, and they're learned, but they have some opinions that are perhaps disagreeable. For us to attack that person publicly would be a disservice to Islam. Why? There are those who take their deen from that person. And so you are removing a person who is a lighthouse of guidance for others, which is wrong. And on Yawm al-Qiyamah, we are going to be questioned about that which we say. Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah himself, in Bidayatul Hidayah, he says that if a person were to live their entire lifetime without once cursing shaitan, they wouldn't be questioned about that on Yawm al-Qiyamah. So why do we feel that we have to mention the names of others? We don't have to. If a person knew that they were going to be questioned for every single name that they mention on Yawm al-Qiyamah, would they be comfortable mentioning the names that we mention so often? We're going to be questioned. But we don't think about our akhirah when we speak. One of the early scholars of Islam, he said that the tongue of the believer is behind his heart. And that relates to another discussion. Do we think with our minds or our hearts? It's irrelevant. But he said that the tongue of the believer is behind his thoughts, you could say. He thinks before he speaks. But the tongue of the hypocrite is in front of his thoughts. He speaks and then he thinks, if he thinks at all. So we should be people that think before we speak. We should make sure that every time we speak, we ponder over that which we're going to say. This statement that I want to make, why am I saying it? Who is going to benefit from it? Is anyone going to benefit from it? Where does it come from? Why do I want to say it? And so on and so forth. And if we find that it's not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's something which could potentially harm our akhirah, then it's best not to say it. Remain silent. Umar radiallahu anh, he said, I have never regretted a word that I have not said. I have never regretted my silence, but I have regretted many words. I believe Ibn Abbas or Ibn Mas'ud, he said, how many words have we said that potentially destroyed all of our actions? The companions were afraid of their words. So imagine us over 1,400 years ago. How many words have we said that have potentially destroyed our deen? Perhaps we may hope that we have something for us with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we've uttered a statement which has nullified all of our good deeds. So we have to be very, very careful with our words. Words are weighty, as was previously stated. Wars are started with words, wars are ended with words. Marriages are started with words, and marriages are ended with words. Relationships are broken via words. You can break a person's heart with a word. Likewise, you can place happiness into a person's heart with a word. Words are very, very weighty. They should not be taken lightly. We should think before we speak. Then he says, وَقَالَ الشَّافَعِي رحمه الله تعالى طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ أَفْضَلُ مِنَ النَّافِلَةِ. That seeking knowledge is more virtuous, is better than voluntary prayer. An aspect of that is because the voluntary prayer only benefits the person who is praying, whereas the knowledge that is being sought benefits the person and benefits others. So it's something which is beneficial not only to himself but to society at large. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ which relates to this. The Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned, although it's weakly attributed to him, but scholars have taken the meaning at the very least. Whoever seeks knowledge for the sake of rectifying the deen and he passes away whilst doing so, there will be only one station between him and the prophets in the akhirah, i.e. he'll be from the Siddiqeen. He's the one from those who inherit from the prophets. And the key there, he has the intention to revive Islam. And revival of Islam starts with revival of the self. A person who is sick cannot cure other sick people. A person has to first cure themselves, or their self, and then they can cure others. Then al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he goes on to the next subcategory, fadilatul ta'aleem, the virtue and the merit of teaching. He says rahimahullah, أما الآيات فقوله عز وجل ولينذروا قومهم إذا رجعوا إليهم لعلهم يحذرون. So in regards to those who did they carried out the action of tafaqquh, learning, so that they may teach their people when their people return back to them. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is indicating, and it's an indication which is compulsory. It's a form of obligating in the language, that we have to have a group of us who learn. It's compulsory. And learning is fard kifaya and fard ayn. it's compulsory upon the individual and compulsory upon the collective. And we'll get into more detail about that in the upcoming pages, inshallah. And al-Ghazali, he comments, وَالْمُرَادُ هُوَ التَّعْلِيمُ وَالْإِرْشَادُ, that the meaning here of the وَلِيُنْذِرُوا is teaching and guiding. So they will teach and guide others. And what does that look like? What does that mean? And so on and so forth. We'll come to see, inshallah. Then he says, وَقَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى وَإِذْ أَخَذَ اللَّهُ مِيثَاقَ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ لِتُبَيِّنُنَّهُ لِلنَّاسِ وَلَا تَكْتُمُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, referring to the people of the book previously, that He took with them a pact, an oath, that they would clarify the meanings of His deen to the people, and they would not conceal it from them. And he says, al-Ghazali, وَهُوَ إِيجَابٌ لِلتَّعْلِيمِ, and he goes on to mention, after mentioning another verse, it's also tahrim lil-kitman. So this verse indicates that it is obligatory to teach and it is prohibited to conceal. And this is something which is often misunderstood. What is it that is compulsory to teach? One of the early scholars of Islam, he mentioned that which is compulsory to teach and prohibited to conceal is that which is agreed upon, that which is considered an asl. Its evidence is authentic, and the evidential indication of it is agreed upon. It's something which is not differed upon. So as an example, وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةِ. This is something all of the Muslims all of the scholars of Islam, all of the Muslims, they agree that it means to establish the prayer. So if a person knows that, then, and they meet someone that does not know that, they have to teach them. Whereas the methodology of prayer, the approach to prayer, how to pray, that's something which, and I mean for example, raise the hands, not to raise the hands. Is the basmala, is it compulsory, is it not compulsory? And so on and so forth. These issues are disagreed about. There are multiple views, which are authentic views, and they are well-established views. So if a person, for example, sees another person who doesn't raise his hands in salah, he can't say to himself, I have to teach this person, it's obligatory upon me to teach this person. No. Why? Because that's a valid difference of opinion. What is obligatory to teach is that which is agreed upon, and the evidence is sound evidence, and it is an agreed upon issue. So a person should not see something which is a difference of opinion and start to try to project his approach or the approach of his particular madhab onto others. We have to respect that there are 4 madhabs in fiqh, and there are 3 mainstream madhabs in aqidah that are practiced globally. As long as a person is following one of those, then alhamdulillah, they're following the way of Ahlul Sunnah, inshaAllah. And the differences of opinion are valid differences of opinion. They are not issues that we need to argue about and debate about. And al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he also mentions on this point that if a person wants to give nasiha to someone, they should only give nasiha to a person who they assume is going to accept their nasiha. If they give nasiha to a person who they know is not going to accept their nasiha, their advice, then they are doing something which is potentially haram. Why? Because it could lead to a greater evil. So you have a young person who goes into a masjid and they perceive that masjid is not following what they refer to as the sunnah, and they try to advise the community of that masjid. What they are actually doing is fitna, something which is prohibited. And Nawawi rahimahullah, if I'm not mistaken, he mentions that as an example, a Hanafi cannot go to a Shafi'i and try to rebuke him for following the Shafi'i opinion. Likewise, a Shafi'i cannot go to a Hanafi and rebuke him for following the Hanafi opinion. But if a person were to come up with a new meaning for وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةِ, then he can be rebuked or she can be rebuked. And of course, in the best of ways, by a person who is suitable to do so. Then he says, وَقَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى وَإِنَّ فَرِيقًا مِّنْهُمْ لَيَكْتُمُونَ الْحَقَّ وَهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ. So again, similar to the verse that we just referred to, talking about the people of the book, that some of them would conceal its meanings from the people. They would purposefully conceal some of the meanings contained in their book from those that did not have access to the book, i.e. they did not have the ability to understand. And he says, وَهُوَ تَحْرِيمٌ لِلْكِتْمَانِ. This is a prohibition of concealing knowledge from others. And knowledge should not be something which is monopolized and made exclusive, which can happen in certain circles. People want to make something exclusive to them. They want to monopolize. No, knowledge is for anyone. And if you look at our history, you find we have scholars, great scholars, from the Arabs, from the Africans, from the Asians, from the Southeast Asians, from the Europeans. Many don't realize we had many great scholars from Europe, in particular Eastern Europe. And we have scholars alive today that are from mainland Europe. So knowledge is for everyone. The only difference between us is the one who receives knowledge is the one who puts in the effort. And the one who receives knowledge is the one who internalizes and practices. That's the difference. Taqwa, which is the consequence of real knowledge. And then he says, رحمه الله, وقال تعالى ادعو إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة. Call to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with wisdom and in the best of ways. Call people to the path of Allah, teach them about the path of Allah, and remind them about the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the best of ways. And of course that has meaning. What does it mean? Shouting at someone is not the best of ways. Rebuking them harshly is not the best of ways. Calling them out on social media or YouTube or whatever else it is not the best of ways. It means having that person's best interest at heart when going to that person to teach them or to remind them or to advise them, etc. Imam al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah, he comments on one of the biographies that he included in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, where talking about the issue of innovation. And al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah, he says, what we have to remind ourselves is those people who engage in innovation, they do so from a place in the heart which is good. They are doing so from a place of love and a place of wanting to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So knowing that, treat them in the best of ways, advise them in the best of ways, the most kindest of ways. And of course, I'm not saying that every person should advise those that they assume to be engaging in innovation, because innovation today is a word which has been completely misused and misunderstood. You'll find a young person accuses someone of innovation, not knowing that that action has been practiced by generations of Islam, and it has evidence in the Sunnah or the Quran or the Sahaba or the scholars that came after them based upon the principles of the Quran and the Sunnah, etc. And the issue of innovation is something which is disagreed upon. What is an innovative act and what is not an innovative act? Someone who follows a particular school of thought in regards to that which is considered an innovation should not attack someone who follows a different school of thought. And again, it's not the time to go into it. But the point being, al-Dhahabi, he reminds us to remind ourselves that those who engage in acts of what we would perceive to be innovation perhaps, they do so from a place of love for Allah and the Messenger. And so we should bear that in mind. And we should have their best interests at heart. Then he says, وَأَمَّا الْأَخْبَارِ فقوله عليه الصلاة والسلام لما بعث معاذا رضي الله تعالى عنه إلى اليمن لأن يهدي الله بك رجلا واحدا خير لك من الدنيا وما فيها. So again, on the virtue of teaching, look what the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام said to Mu'adh when he sent him to Yemen. For Allah to guide through you one person, it's better for you than this dunya and everything in it. People are chasing after this dunya, and no matter how long you chase, no matter how much effort you put into your chase, you are not going to acquire perhaps even 0.0001% of what this dunya can offer. Yet the Prophet ﷺ is saying, if Allah facilitates guidance for someone through you, it's better than this dunya and everything that this dunya contains. And of course the greatest form of guidance is teaching. Because when you teach someone, you are teaching them something that they can apply for the rest of their life. And so we should ask ourselves, how can we be involved in the process of teaching others today? Everyone can adopt a role. You have those that can teach, those that can facilitate for that teaching to reach others, those that can develop programs and apps and applications on the computer and so on and so forth that enable others who don't have access to teaching to access that teaching. As an example, on the smartphones today, you have Quran apps. Imagine the reward that those who came up with those Quran apps are receiving. You have now imams that use those apps, people that do khutbahs using those apps, scholars are using those apps, people that are memorizing the Quran are using those apps, people that are teaching the Quran are using those apps, people that are reciting the Quran on a daily basis are using those apps. And maybe 2 or 3, 4, 5, I'm not sure how many people it takes to develop an app of such nature, but they are receiving the reward. Imagine. So we have to use our minds to come up with innovative ways in being involved in the process of teaching, the process of learning, the process of advising and guiding. Then he says, al-Ghazali rahimahullah, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام إن الله عز وجل لا ينتزع العلم انتزاعا من الناس بعد أن يؤتيهم إياه. So the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not simply take knowledge from those whom he has given it to after he has given it to them. So he's talking about when knowledge will disappear. ولكن يذهب بذهاب العلماء, but it disappears with the disappearance of the ulama. Knowledge will disappear with the disappearance of the ulama. And we mentioned last week the statement of Ali radiallahu anhu, when a person of knowledge passes away, a hole in Islam is left which is not filled except by another person of knowledge similar to him. So if that person has not been able to pass his knowledge on to someone else, then the hole will not be filled. And then he says, عليه الصلاة والسلام, فكل ما ذهب عالم ذهب بما معه من العلم حتى إذا لم يبقى إلا رؤساء جهالا إن سئلوا أفتوا بغير علم فيضلون ويضلون. He says that knowledge will, the Prophet ﷺ said that knowledge would be taken away by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the death of the ulama, until a time arrives wherein the only people remaining are those who are actually ignorant, who have been taken as people of knowledge. They will be asked and they will give the wrong counsel. And so they will misguide others as well as misguiding themselves, or they will misguide themselves and or be misguided and misguide others. And it makes you think when you look at our time today. And it's not that we should be judgmental of others, we should look at ourselves. Am I involved in such a process? Am I a person who has been taken as a person of knowledge and I am not qualified to be taken as such? And the indication that this is the case is if a person speaks about Islam not having studied Islam properly. If a person speaks about Islam and that person has not actually studied Islam properly, then they are at risk of falling into this. Today, you only have to go online to see examples of individuals who have been taken as leaders. They are taken as people who know what they're talking about, and actually they don't know what they're talking about. And those that have studied will realize this. And they are asked, and so they provide the wrong answers. They are harming themselves and harming others. One of the key factors to understanding something is the ability to contextualize it. In order to apply something, you have to understand the context that it came from and the context that you are applying it into. If not, then you can harm the person who you are applying it with, or the society, the context within which you are applying it. As an example, if a doctor prescribed a particular type of medicine to someone without asking certain questions, what could possibly happen is that that person can become extremely sick. Why? Perhaps they are allergic to some of the ingredients contained within that medicine. If a doctor asks someone about, or does not ask someone, I should say, or does not check their medical history to make sure that this medicine is suitable for that person, they could potentially kill that person. And it's the same with anything. The deen is even worse. If a person comes to a perceived scholar and asks that person who is perceived to be a scholar about a simple matter such as wudu, and that person doesn't know how to answer, it can lead to the individual leaving Islam. How so? If a person who has severe OCD, for example, comes to someone perceived to be a scholar and asks them a question about wudu, and this person who is perceived to be a scholar doesn't realize that this person has an OCD, they can give them information which will make wudu so difficult for them that they say it's better for me if I don't pray. It becomes so difficult for them, they end up not praying. And that leads to them leaving Islam. And this is a reality. Knowing the mustafti is as important as knowing the fatwa. To know the questioner is as important as knowing the answer to the question. The answer is not the same for every individual. And this is one of the problems of our time, where you have individuals translating answers given by scholars in a completely different society and completely different context. Or you have individuals calling up scholars in completely different societies and a completely different context. It's not something which is applicable. Or you have individuals that read the states of the earlier generations of Islam, the Salaf, and they try to apply that into our context. These things can break a person. So understanding the context is very important. I asked one of my teachers once about, I was reading from Sir A'lam al-Nubala by al-Dhahabi rahimahullah, and when you read their biographies and you read their states, you ask, how can a person possibly live like this without, losing their minds? They would stay up all night crying, and they would be so fearful of the akhirah, they wouldn't be able to have normal social interactions. They wouldn't be able to eat or sleep or even have a normal relationship with their spouses. And he said it's important that when you read that which relates to the implication of Islam, especially when it comes to that which relates to tarbiyah, that you read that which is contextualized to your time. Why? Because you're not reading with the perception of that time, you're reading with the perception of your time. And it's very easy to project your own perception onto a previous time. So, and you can very easily read onto the text rather than reading from the text. So when we look at our time, we have to understand the time that we're living in order to understand what piety is. If we don't, then we can harm ourselves and harm others. So learning to contextualize is very, very important. And a person who may have memorized all of the books of hadith and the Quran in its entirety with the various modes of recitation, if that person does not understand how to apply the knowledge, does not understand how to contextualize the knowledge, or if they assume that they know how, it can be very, very dangerous. In fiqh, for example, you have the science of giving fatwa. For example, in the Hanafi school, you have Rasm al-Mufti, a very famous text which focuses solely on the issue of the principles of giving fatwa. This is a part of our tradition, and it's important to think about these things before we speak. How many issues have we seen recently where someone that doesn't actually have the qualification to speak has spoken and caused problems? So we have to be very careful that we don't fall into that. And we also have to be careful that we don't judge others. Whenever we read a text like al-Ghazali's, rahimahullah, or anything which relates to betterment of the self, we have to keep our own selves in mind and make sure we don't start to think about this person or that person and so on and so forth. No, contextualize it to the self. Contemplate over the self. Do I fall into these things? Am I doing these things? On social media, do I put my opinions out there sometimes? If I do, am I qualified to do so? And so on and so forth. And then al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he says, وَقَالَ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ مَنْ عَلِمَ عِلْمًا فَكَتَمَهُ أَلْجَمَهُ اللَّهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ بِلِجَامٍ مِّن نَارٍ. So he mentions a hadith, a statement of the Prophet ﷺ, which indicates that a person who has acquired understanding of something in Islam and he conceals it from the people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will place upon him a bridle of fire as a punishment. Now again, that has to be contextualized. This is for the learned person. It's not for a person who's in the process of learning. It's not for a person who has read a hadith or read a verse of the Quran or maybe studied a book. No, it's for the person who is learned. The learned person who conceals something is potentially going to be punishable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As for the person who is unlearned, They are not qualified to speak in the first place. For them, not speaking is what they should do. And if everyone if all those in our time who are not qualified to speak remain silent, half of our problems would disappear. It's a reality. Half of our problems would disappear. And so we should make sure that we are not drops in the ocean of confusion that is drowning us today. And it might sound harsh, but it's a reality. If I am not qualified to speak, I should not speak. And if I do so, I am potentially causing harm to others. The person who knows that they are ignorant, that's the person who's going to learn. The person who thinks that they know, they're not going to learn anything. What's the point in going to a lesson if you already know? So again, contextualize this. It's for the scholar, the learned person. With family, for example, perhaps you might be in a position where you can teach them. With a community member, perhaps you can teach them something which they may not know, the basics of something. But as for on a public platform, in a public space, we should remain silent. And we should not get involved in that which we do not have the qualification to do so. And when I say qualification, I don't mean that a person has graduated from some sort of institution and so on and so forth. No, I mean that a person has actually studied the foundational sciences of Islam. They actually know what they are talking about. They know that there are differences of opinion. They know where they can go to see these differences of opinion. They know the principles of fatwa and so on and so forth. And on this note, just maybe to give some example, some of my teachers who were teaching in the haram, they were teaching on chairs in the haram. For example, Sheikh Amir Bahjat, who was teaching in the haram, so he had been given that position. When he was asked, and he would teach fiqh, when he was asked an issue which related to something actually happening in a person's life, he would say, this is a fatwa, I don't give fatwa. I am teaching for those that are trying to basically learn, i.e. the talibu ilm, but I don't give fatwa. He said, if you want a fatwa, there are muftis here that give fatwa, go to them. He wouldn't get involved. We asked him a question about aqeedah once. He said, I'm not specialized in aqeedah. My area is fiqh. I don't speak about issues of aqeedah. If someone would say that today publicly, people will accuse this person of not knowing the aqeedah, or subhanallah, how can he not speak about aqeedah, and so on and so forth. But this is a learned person of Islam who has studied with some very well-known scholars and so on and so forth, given a position in the haram. Another one of my teachers, Sheikh Abdullah Ashiq Ilahi al-Barni, whose father was very, very famous. He authored many books that are studied here in the UK today. Imagine, like, look at when we would ask him a question, he would say, I will go to find out from some of the elders, from some of the seniors. And when people would ask him questions, they would say, for example, رَفَعَ اللَّهُ قَدْرَكَ, which means may Allah raise your rank. He would say, no, don't say that. Say, غَفَرَ اللَّهُ لَكَ وَعَفَى عَنْكَ. Say, may Allah forgive you and overlook your mistakes. Those are scholars. Why? Because they knew where they were. They would say such things because they knew where they were. They were focused on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were interacting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And لَا نُزَكِّي عَلَى اللَّهِ أَحَدًا. But that's what we hope and we perceive. And so we should learn from the humility of the people of knowledge. And we can see Imam Malik, rahimahullah, for example, someone came to him, asked him questions, and he said, I don't know. And they said to him, so what should we say to the people when we go back? We've traveled to you from another land. He said, say to them, Imam Malik doesn't know. That's it. Not qualified to speak. So knowing our place is very, very important. Then he mentioned the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام إذا مات ابن آدم انقطع عمله إلا من ثلاث علم ينتفع به. Al-hadith. So he mentioned a part of the hadith that a person, when they pass away, all of their actions will cease except for three. From those, al-ilm yuntafa'u bih, knowledge that he left behind that people benefit from. So perhaps a book that he's left behind, or someone that he's taught who continues to teach after him, and so on and so forth. And then he says, وَأَمَّا الْآثَارِ. So now he's going to mention, in the original anyway, some of the statements of the companions and the scholars of Islam, etc., that followed the companions. But here in the Tahdhib, he's only going to mention one. فقال معاذ بن جبل رضي الله تعالى عنه, he mentioned the statement of Mu'adh, تعلموا العلم فإن تعلمه لله خشية. He says, seek out knowledge, learn knowledge, because learning it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an act of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's khashya. وطلبه عبادة, and seeking it out, going to the places where you can seek out knowledge is worship. And just on this point here, we should not become lazy and rely upon online learning. It's very easy to say, I'm going to catch this when it's online. I'm going to study this book online. I can listen to this lecture online. It's not the same process. It's not the same, experience. Learning in person, nothing beats that. Learning in person, there is a relationship that develops and, something which takes place. So it's important to try to learn when we have the opportunity, when the opportunity presents itself, because the time may come where the opportunities cease and we will regret that which we did not learn when the opportunity was there to learn it. And he says, وَمُدَارَسَتَهُ تَسْبِيحٌ, its revision, its study is a form of tasbih, remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالْبَحْثَ عَنْهُ jihad, and looking for it, searching it out. Where can I study? Going to look for places and individuals to study with. It's a form of jihad, struggling for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَتَعْلِيمَهُ مَنْ لَا يَعْلَمُهُ صَدَقَةٌ, and teaching it to those who do not know it is a form of charity. All of this from one thing, knowledge. If a person learns something, look at all of this. وَبَذْلَهُ لِأَهْلِهِ قُرْبَةٌ, and to give it to its people, i.e. the people of knowledge, is an act of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and devotion. وَهُوَ الْأَنِيسُ فِي الْوَحْدَةِ, and it is the comforting friend in times of loneliness. When a person is feeling down, they can open up their books and they can find comfort in the statements of the early people of Islam, the scholars of Islam, the righteous of the past. They can busy themselves with learning, and it becomes their comforting friend. وَالصَّاحِبُ فِي الْخَلْوَةِ, and it is a companion in times of seclusion. When a person is alone with his or her books, studying, they're not really alone. They're giving life to the people of the past, and the people of the past are giving life to them, giving life to their hearts, or to their heart, I should say. Hopefully they don't have more than one heart. وَالدَّلِيلُ عَلَى الدِّينِ, and it is, ilm is like an usher, pointing a person towards the deen. And that's what's interesting for us. If you think about it, this book, we're reading a book which is nearly 1,000 years old. A classical book, nearly 1,000 years old. So if in society we have issues with the deen, the way it's practiced, maybe it's become obscured, we always have the classical books of Islam which give us the real approach to practicing Islam. وَالْمُصَبِّرُ عَلَى السَّرَّاءِ وَالضَّرَّاءِ, and it is what gives a person patience in times of felicity and times of hardship. And a person, an interesting point, that a person has to have patience in good times and bad times. When a person receives a blessing, and when a blessing, or what they perceive to be a blessing, and what they perceive to be a calamity. Why? A person needs to be patient upon wealth, for example. If a person is not patient upon their wealth, what does that even mean? It means being patient in sticking to the framework of Islam with their wealth, not spending it in places they shouldn't spend it, giving it to those that they need to give it to, and so on and so forth. Likewise, in times of calamity, reminding themselves, anything which afflicts me has come from Allah, and that which comes from Allah is better for me, whether I realize it or not. وَالْوَزِيرُ عِنْدَ الْأَخِلَّاءِ, and it's like the close helper when surrounded by those that are close to us. وَالْقَرِيبُ عِنْدَ الْغُرَبَاءِ, and it is the closest to us in times of estrangement, or when we are with the strangers. وَمَنَارُ سَبِيلِ الْجَنَّةِ, and it is the lighthouse guiding us towards the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يرفع الله به أقواما فيجعلهم في الخير قادة سادة هدى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with knowledge raises people and turns them in that which is good. And this is important. In that which is good, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes them leaders and makes them individuals who are followed. يقتدى بهم أدلة في الخير تقتص آثارهم وترمق أفعالهم. Their stories, their lives are studied and followed even after they have passed away. and their actions become examples for those that follow them. All of this comes from what? Knowledge. If you were to try to find out, as we said last week, if you were to try to find out who was the wealthiest person living 1,000 years ago, it would be very difficult to find out and it would be irrelevant. But you can try to find who was the most knowledgeable from the scholars of Islam, because they discussed it in their books, because knowledge was what made them virtuous and knowledge was what made them praiseworthy to their peers, and so their lives were documented, their names were mentioned. You can read about them today, and through their remembrance Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings light and iman into our hearts. Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he famously said that the remembrance of the righteous is more beloved to me than the discussion of issues of fiqh. Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, in his explanation of Sahih Muslim, he gives a large portion of the first part to discussing some of the individuals mentioned in the chain of Imam Muslim, and he concludes that section by mentioning that the famous statement, بِذِكْرِ الصَّالِحِينَ تَنْزِلُ الرَّحْمَةِ, through the remembrance of the righteous Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends His mercy. And so when you become a person of knowledge, you become a means of guiding others, not only in your lifetime but in your death. And the question is, of course, real knowledge. What is real knowledge? How can we acquire and determine what real knowledge is? How can we apply it? And so on and so forth. And al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he discusses it, as we mentioned, later on inshallah. So we're not going to go into too much detail. And now we've come to al-Shawahid al-Aqliyah. So we'll continue with that next week inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.